Hi everyone, it's William with this week's edition of the Romanov Dynasty of Russia, my YouTube series exploring the relationship between the Romanov dynasty and the Russian state and what role the Romanov Grand Dukes played in that relationship. So I want to start out today showing you, we are currently, I should say, in the first in the 17th century, or I'm sorry, no, we're in the 18th century. We have led the 17th century behind, but I'm going to show you a photograph of something from the 20th century, after the revolution, in fact, in the 1930s, in Paris, among the Russian diaspora, the Tsarist Russian diaspora in Europe, there was, and well, all over the world, but this in particular in France, there was a group that was founded called the Young Russia Party, and the idea of the Young Russia Party was they were very strongly nationalist, and the idea was to have something like a Soviet monarchy, they called it, in Russia. And it has some interesting symbolism. So that is relevant for this theme that we're talking about of the dynasty and the state and how they interacted. And this particular political group was backed by the self-proclaimed emperor in exile, Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich, and a more overt role as chairman of the main council of the Young Russia Party was played by Kirill's cousin, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich. And so he actually very actively went out and gave speeches on behalf of the Young Russia Party. And so it wasn't just an emigre group. It was one that was tied in with the surviving members of the Russian imperial family. Not all of them, of course. So I'll try and show you this photograph. I have to check. That's not good. Let's see. I hope you can see it the most. So here you have the orb, the royal orb with a cross on it, and it says Union of Young Russians. And then at the bottom, if I can manage to show that, that says, "We are not red or white, we are Russians." And so red and white referring to, as you know, the communists, the Bolsheviks were called Reds, and the Tsarist troops during the Russian Civil War were called the Whites for whatever reason. So here's another one. You can see more clearly at the top. It says Union of Young Russians, Tsar and Soviets. And then down below, long live the Tsar of the workers. So an interesting integration of ideas there. So the Tsar and Soviets, you see, in the 18th century, where we are now, we have just ceased to have tsars, and instead we have emperors. So you could still call an emperor a tsar in relation to the peasantry and the mystical side of things, the mystical relationship between the tsar and the people, the peasantry. But, you know, outside of that, in a geopolitical sense, it would have been a gaffe to call a ruler of Russia Tsar or Tsaritsa. They had become an emperor. They'd become emperors and empresses. But in the Young Russia movement, they reverted to that idea of the Tsar, who's so intrinsically, even mystically connected to the people, although this time it was directed at the workers. So at the proletarians, the Tsar of the workers. So very interesting development. And the more we are able to delve back into the first full century of Romanov rule, the more we are able to understand these things. And really, you have to take a look at Muscovy and Peter in order to really establish a basis for understanding these things. Okay, we stopped last time mentioning that the Empress Elizabeth, who is Peter the Great's daughter, who came to the throne in 1742 at her coronation, deliberately had elements and symbols and people to emphasize the fact that the state was now the supreme idea, the supreme conception, and she introduced prominent servitors to the public as champions of the empire's well-being. So, so we've come a long ways from when Russia was just Muscovy and Holy Mother Rus, and slowly modernizing, and then Peter the Great came and just, the modernization of the service class of people, the nobility and educated people, was just an amazing success, amazingly rapid success. We've already talked about how the peasants were left out of that, so I won't say more about that. And, going over the 18th century Romanov rulers last time, we talked about the fact that 3 Russian emperors were actually murdered during the 18th century. So it was certainly the bloodiest century within the 3 centuries of Romanov rule. So the first one, Ivan VI, the nameless one, as he was called, literally an infant when he was ousted from the throne by his aunt and forced to grow up in a dungeon, basically, in the Schlüsselburg fortress. And he was killed because he was inconvenient to her more than anything else, because she wanted to be on the throne, and he was just a little baby of a few months when he came to the throne, and he was easy to get out of the way. But the other 2 who were murdered, Peter III and Paul I, were examples of how there were, this fault line that was between the dynasty and the state could come to the fore if they had different interpretations, if the representatives of the state had a different interpretation of what constituted Russian greatness from the conception of that the ruler had, representing the dynasty. So Peter III and Paul I were both very clear examples of how on both sides they could claim to be upholding the Petrine ideal of putting the state first, and at the same time clashing so seriously that the ruler was then gotten out of the way in the name of the greater good of the state itself. So this series is not about the rulers themselves. It's about Grand Dukes, but in this period before we have really Grand Dukes coming into play, Paul would end up having 4 sons, and so that would be the first time in Russia in the 18th century when there would actually be Grand Dukes who were not designated as an heir to the throne, who were pioneering Grand Ducal role. But we're going to talk about Paul's reign, and we're going to talk about Catherine the Great's reign separately. But right now I want to highlight not the Grand Dukes, but what was going on with the rulers in their in their dispute with the upper echelon servitors, whom Peter had successfully inculcated with this idea that the glory and greatness of the state needed to be protected at all cost, and that their own personal sense of worth and honor and identity were tied up with the greatness of the state. And if the greatness of the state were to be diminished, then they personally would be dishonored and diminished. All right, so let's dive in. Outraged national pride played an indisputable role in the assassination of Peter III, who fell far short of Petrine ideals, both physically and behaviorally. So if you're researching the Romanovs at all, or looking at Russian history with respect to the Romanovs, important to remember that Peter the Great had set the bar very, very, very high for what kind of ruler could be simpatico by embodying with the state, by embodying this the glory of the state. And it wasn't hard for Peter, who was a very intelligent, dynamic, tall, almost 7 feet tall man who, people had no problem looking at him and seeing reflected in him or embodied in him the glory of the state. But now that high bar is going to be something that every Romanov ruler, whether male or female, is either going to have to find a way to express themselves effectively, or else they are going to be in trouble. So Peter the Third was one who fell short of this. And there is the fact, on the one hand, that he was German. He was born in Germany, so you didn't have a country called Germany at that time, but this sort of this conglomerate of German kingdoms and grand duchies and states, joined by a single language. So he was the son of the Duke of Schleswig-Holstein-Gottorp, who had married Peter's other daughter, Anna, and both of them died when the future Peter III was just a little boy. I think his father died when he was 11. His mother had died earlier, and he himself at age 11 became Duke Karl Peter Ulrich of Schleswig-Holstein-Gottorp, and that was his identity, and that was how he saw himself, and identity is so important in all of this. So then he was brought by his aunt Elizabeth, Peter the Great's daughter, to be her heir. So she was at least responsible enough, you could say, to name an heir. She had seen how it was disastrous very often when an heir wasn't named, and there was nothing to prevent her from choosing whoever she wanted to be her heir, to be the next Russian ruler. So she chose her nephew. He was 11. He was, she could bring him up the way she wanted to. But in Peter's case, so he changed his name. He took on the name Peter. It was one of his German names as well. In Peter's case, he just didn't take to it. He didn't like Russia. He really had a very strong identity as a German duke. And it was apparently clear to the people around him that he was a German to the core. So he flaunted his German identity at a time when, as an adult, at a time when Russian victories over Prussia in the 7 Years' War had nurtured a high degree of patriotic pride amongst educated Russians in general and military men in particular. He forced Prussian drill and dress upon the troops and enraged his officers by withdrawing Russia from war with Prussia on the eve of a brilliant victory. And he also returned territory that Russia had conquered in Germany. He returned territory that Russia had conquered to Germany. He just gave it back to them. And I believe this was actually called the second miracle of Brandenburg. I'm not sure what the first miracle was, but yeah, imagine being in a war when the enemy leader, there's a change of leadership, and the enemy leader just says, oh, okay, here, take this back, because I'm one of you, essentially. So was this the reason? Well, it definitely was a reason, but it wasn't the fact that he was German per se, because his bride, Catherine, was, who would become Catherine the Great, was a German princess named Sophia, and she was just as German as he was. I think she came to Russia when she was 16, having never been there before. And that was not held against her. You know, she became Catherine the Great, and she found a way, even as a woman, to embody Russia's greatness to the extent that she too ended up being called the Great. Only she and Peter the First received that designation. So it wasn't that he was German per se, it was his identity, and it was the way he expressed his identity that made Peter a candidate for assassination in Russia. So one thing that he did try to do was to win the favor of his nobility, was he issued a decree in 1762 freeing the Russian nobility from compulsory service. So that was something that would have been anathema to Peter the Great himself, because he was the one who had instituted compulsory service on the part of the nobility. You could have no portion in the public life of the empire, in imperial glory, in anything like that. You could just, stay on your own country estate and rot, or you could go and have a real service role, starting at the lowest possible rank and working your way up. So this was the other principle that was very much hanging by a thread in the 18th century. This principle so important to Peter the Great about service and promotion based on meritocracy. And you could start out as a common person at the very lowest rank in the civil service or the military. And if you were talented and you had the energy and the drive and the will, you could make your way up through the ranks and become, a top officer, a general, an admiral. And when you reached officer status, you were automatically ennobled. And of course, the nobility had hated that. They didn't want to have competitors from the lower classes of society, and they didn't want anything that countered this narrative of the importance of birth. So this was a real bone that Peter was throwing to them by freeing them from this compulsory service. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to make up for the damage that he was doing to imperial pride. And I should have said to begin with that Peter III had a very, very short reign. I think probably the second shortest after poor little Ivan VI, which was only, I think, a couple months. And in Peter's case, he became the emperor at Elizabeth's death. He became the emperor in January 1762, and he was overthrown and then killed in July 1762. So very short. People were horrified from the beginning at what he was doing, and he also had a woman of great abilities and ambitions there to make sure that whatever resentments existed would be the flames would be fanned, and she could use that to her advantage. All right, my dogs are starting to bark. I have been unhappy lately with going a half an hour or 40 minutes even with these, so I'm going to try to do it a little shorter, a little shorter with each video. Plus, I am really inarticulate today. I apologize for that. So we will move on to Paul next time, and we will get the full details on what happened to Peter III when we talk about the reign of Catherine the Great, separately from this preliminary section. So, yeah, I want to just mention before I sign off, I want to just mention a few books that I think you might be interested in. When I was working on my dissertation, which was way back in the 90s, and then it was accepted and I received my PhD in 2000, I was allowed sort of privileged access to a manuscript that had not yet been published. And I should have looked this up so that I could tell you if the book had subsequently been published. That was a long time ago. And the author was or is N.S. Coleman, Kollman. And the title that was being used for the manuscript was Honor and Society in Early Russia. So great, valuable book that contributed a lot to my understanding of things. So have a look for that. And then I wanted to mention we'll be, as I said, we'll be doing more about Catherine the Great's reign in due course. But the really seminal work, as I understand it, my knowledge may be a little bit dated, but on Catherine the Great and her reign is by Isabel de Madariaga. And the title is, what is the full title? I know it begins with the name Catherine. I'm sorry, I should have written down the whole title. I repeat that one of the single most valuable books that I found in understanding the Romanov dynasty and how they presented themselves to the Russian people symbolically, and their mythos, is by Richard Wortman. It's called Scenarios of Power, and that surname is spelled Wortman. Not sure exactly how to pronounce it. And then when we start talking, as we will next week, about the Emperor Pavel, one of the most valuable books that I found, really very valuable because it's a primary source, written by N.A. Sablukov. Unfortunately, it hasn't been translated that I know of. Actually, I should do the translation of that. It's such an interesting book. And it's called Zapiski Uchasnikov и Sovremennikov. So, Tsara Ubistva 11 Marta 1801. Sorry, I'm saying that in English. I hate numbers in Russian. 1801 Gada Zapiski Uchasnikov и Sovremennikov. So it is, the whole book is excellent. So it's not just Sablukov, but it's accounts by participants, Uchasnikov, and contemporaries, Sovremennikov, who were there at the time of Paul's murder on 11th March 1801, and really fascinating, and I really learned so much from it. The book was published in St. Petersburg in 1899, so not an easy one to get a hold of. You pretty much have to have access to a university library or to be able to get things through interlibrary loan. But if you read Russian and you're interested in all of this, do have a look at it. So the other one I'll mention briefly is by Roderick McGrew, Paul I of Russia. It was published by Oxford University Press in 1992, and you can't go wrong with that. So I'll have more. I don't always remember, I want to give you the names of the books and the articles that I drew on, when I was compiling this, but I don't always remember, so I'll try to keep up with that, and definitely come back to hear the preliminary information about Paul the First and what he did to spoil, in the eyes of his servitors, the impression that he made, and to fall so far short of the Petrine ideal that he was actually murdered. All right, see you next time.